This is the last of it, fellas. We need to move quick.
In the world of the gun, they tell you the man you have to worry about is the one with the loudest mouth or the fastest trigger. They're wrong. The man you really have to worry about is the one who doesn't have to pull the trigger at all. In 1950, that man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Most people see a gangster and see a predator. But in Harlem, Bumpy was the cage. He was the only thing standing between the neighborhood and the hungry wolves of the Italian Five Families. Down in Lower Manhattan, the Italians had the unions and the docks, but uptown, above 110th Street, the air belonged to Bumpy. It was a time of Pax Bumpy, a cold, hard peace. It was a world where you could leave your front door unlocked because the local thieves were more afraid of Bumpy Johnson than they were of the NYPD. It was a world where a black man from Charleston could sit at a table with the Genovese family and not just ask for a seat, but dictate the price of the chair. But power is a funny thing. It doesn't always break in a flash of gunfire. Sometimes it just thins out. This is the story of a man who was too strong to be killed, too smart to be caught, and yet somehow became a ghost in his own kingdom. This is the fall of Bumpy Johnson. By 1952, the feds realized they couldn't break Bumpy's grip on Harlem from the inside, so they decided to snatch him out of it entirely. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics came for him with a drug conspiracy charge, a heavy iron collar for a man who prided himself on being a protector of his people. Bumpy called it a frame-up until the day he died, but in the courtroom, the truth mattered less than the optics. The government didn't want the truth. They wanted a snitch. They dangled a lighter sentence in front of him, a way out, a chance to keep his throne if only he'd point a finger at his Italian partners in the Genovese family. But Bumpy Johnson was a man of the old world. He lived by a code that was already starting to rust. He didn't bend, and he certainly didn't talk. To Bumpy, his word was the only currency that never devalued. He chose silence, and in return, the judge handed him 15 years in Alcatraz. Think about that. 15 years. They weren't just sending him to prison. They were sending him to a rock in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, thousands of miles away from the streets that breathed for him. On his final night of freedom, Bumpy didn't panic. He sat with his lieutenants, calm as a Sunday morning, and gave them one simple order. Hold the line. He spoke like a man who expected the world to stand still just because he told it to. He thought his name alone would be enough to keep the vultures at bay. He didn't realize that in the underworld, 15 years isn't just a sentence, it's an eternity. As Bumpy boarded that bus for the long ride west, he was still the king. What he didn't know was that while he was guarding the code of silence in a cold cell, the world he left behind was already preparing to forget him. While Bumpy was staring at the gray walls of Alcatraz, the sun was setting on the Harlem he knew. In prison, time is measured in shadows and chess moves. Bumpy sat across from inmates playing the long game, thinking 3 steps ahead, convinced that his kingdom was being kept warm for his return. But back on 125th Street, the game hadn't just changed. The board had been flipped over. The numbers game, that old-school community bank that Bumpy used to protect, was being pushed into the corners. A new king was rising, and its name was heroin. It wasn't about the quiet dignity of the old rackets anymore. It was about a high that could strip a neighborhood to the bone. And the Genovese family, they were businessmen first. With Bumpy 3,000 miles away, they realized they didn't need a middleman with a moral compass. They didn't need a gatekeeper to give them permission to walk through Harlem. The Italians started making side deals with the young wolves, the hungry, undisciplined hustlers who didn't care about Pax Bumpy. These kids were cheaper to buy and easier to break. They didn't want a seat at the table. They just wanted the crumbs, and the Italians were happy to feed them. Picture the contrast. Bumpy in the prison yard, moving a wooden knight with precision and discipline, while back home, the streets were descending into a fever dream of needles and chaos. The hierarchy was crumbling. The respect for the elders was evaporating. By the time 1963 rolled around and the gates of Alcatraz finally swung open, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just coming home to a different city, he was coming home as a ghost. He stepped off that bus and saw the crowds cheering his name, but if you looked closely at the eyes of the young men on the corners, they weren't looking at a king. They were looking at a museum piece. The ghost had returned, but he was about to find out that you can't rule a world that has forgotten how to take orders. When Bumpy touched down in Harlem in 1963, it looked like a scene out of a movie. The streets were lined with people, the flashbulbs were popping, and the cheers echoed off the brownstones like he was a conquering hero returning from the wars. On the surface, it looked like the king had reclaimed his throne. But as the parade ended and the sirens faded, the silence that followed was colder than any prison cell. Bumpy walked back into his old headquarters, expecting to see the well-oiled machine he'd left behind. Instead, he found a ghost ship. When the lieutenants brought out the envelopes, the tribute from the streets, they were light, terribly light. The numbers were down, the protection money was drying up, and the faces in the room wouldn't meet his eyes. There was respect in that room, sure, but it was the kind of respect you give a grandfather at a wake, fond, nostalgic, and totally devoid of fear. The real blow came when he sat down with the new leadership of the Genovese family. In the old days, they sat as equals. Now, the Italians looked at him with a sort of polite pity. They didn't shout, they didn't threaten, they just spoke to him like a man who had outstayed his welcome. They told him the world had moved on. They offered him a subsistence cut, a little taste to keep him comfortable in his retirement. But the partnership? That was over. They weren't asking for his permission to run Harlem anymore. They were telling him he was lucky to still have a seat at the table. It was the ultimate reality check. Bumpy had spent a decade holding on to a code of silence, thinking he was protecting a kingdom, only to realize he'd been guarding an empty vault. He was back in the world, but he was realizing the most painful truth a powerful man can face. The world didn't wait for him. It didn't even pause. Bumpy wasn't the type to go quietly. From 64 to 66, he went back to what he knew: muscle. He started leaning on the young hustlers, cracking heads to remind the neighborhood whose name was on the deed. He used the old methods: the switchblade, the heavy-handed threats, the terrifying stare that used to make grown men tremble, but he was trying to fix a leaking dam with a hammer. Every time Bumpy pushed, the Italians did something he wasn't prepared for. They didn't send hitmen to his door, they didn't start a shooting war in the middle of Lenox Avenue. Instead, they just turned off the faucet. They began the silent squeeze. Suddenly, the heroin shipments Bumpy's men were waiting for just didn't arrive. The supply lines went dry. The Mafia didn't need to outgun Bumpy, they just had to outsource him. They choked his business until his own soldiers started looking at him not as a leader, but as a liability. You can't pay a crew with nostalgia, and you can't run a street corner without product. The breaking point came at a quiet sit-down in a back room downtown. Bumpy did what he always did. He stood his ground. He looked the Italian capos in the eye and threatened a scorched earth war that would turn Harlem into a graveyard. But the response wasn't fear. It was a cold, calculated logic. The capo didn't even raise his voice. He simply explained that a war wouldn't kill the Italians. It would just kill Harlem. He told Bumpy that if the bullets started flying, the cops would swarm the blocks, the business would vanish, and the only people suffering would be the black families Bumpy claimed to protect. They neutralized him with economics. They showed him that his power was just an illusion they allowed him to keep. To keep his head above water, to keep his people from starving, Bumpy had to swallow the bitterest pill of his life. He accepted the lesser share. He became a middleman for the people who used to be his peers. He survived, but the king was now a vassal. By 1967, the very air in Harlem had changed. It was thick with the scent of rebellion and the heat of a new generation that didn't play by the rules of the gentleman gangster. The civil rights era was hardening into the Black Power movement. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who once stood as the symbol of black defiance, was suddenly looking like a relic of a past that people wanted to burn down. To the young wolves like Frank Lucas and the street radicals, Bumpy wasn't a hero anymore. They saw an old man who sat at tables with the Italians, a man who paid tribute to downtown families. They didn't see a gatekeeper, they saw a collaborator. The word Uncle Tom began to whisper through the alleyways, a sting sharper than any blade Bumpy had ever felt. Then came April 1968. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. set the world on fire. Harlem erupted. The streets became a sea of shattered glass and soaring flames. Bumpy, ever the man of order, stepped out into the smoke. He patrolled the blocks he had ruled for decades, raising his voice, commanding the youth to stop the looting, to preserve their own neighborhood. But for the first time in 30 years, nobody listened. The rioters ran right past him. They pushed him aside like he was just another old man shouting at the wind. His name, once a shield that could stop a heart, now carried no weight against the raw, unchanneled rage of a generation that didn't know his history and didn't care about his code. That was the spiritual death of Bumpy Johnson. Standing on a burning corner in the middle of a riot, he realized the ultimate tragedy. He had spent his life fighting to be the protector of Harlem, but Harlem no longer wanted his protection. He was an emperor standing in the middle of 125th Street with no clothes, no crown, and no kingdom. The world was on fire, and he didn't even have the power to blow out a match. July 7, 1968, 2 a.m. The world outside was still smoldering from a summer of unrest, but inside Wells' restaurant the lights were warm and the air smelled of fried chicken and dark coffee. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual spot, dressed to the nines, sharp suit, silk tie, every hair in place. He was surrounded by his inner circle, the few men who still remembered what the name Bumpy Johnson used to mean. He was eating, talking, playing the part of the king one last time. But the weight of the last few years, the prison time, the Italian squeeze, the riots, the loss of his streets, was a burden no man could carry forever. He didn't go out in a hail of gunfire. There was no dramatic betrayal, no cinematic shootout with the Genovese hitmen. Instead, Bumpy simply stopped. He reached for his chest, his brow furrowing not in fear, but in a strange kind of realization. He complained of a sharp pain, a tightening, the sound of a heart finally giving up on a world it no longer recognized. As he collapsed, the restaurant didn't explode into chaos. It just paused. The Godfather of Harlem slid from his chair and onto the floor, dying in the arms of his friends. The tragedy wasn't that he died, it was how easily the world moved on. The Italians didn't have to spend a single cent on a contract. The young dealers didn't have to risk a day in court to take his spot. They all just waited for the clock to do what their guns couldn't. As the ambulance pulled away from the curb, the sirens fading into the Harlem night, the hustle on the corner didn't stop for a second. The new breed of dealers, men like Frank Lucas, just looked up for a moment and then went right back to work. The transition was complete. The era of the gentleman gangster was buried, and the era of the narco-state had begun. Bumpy Johnson outlived his enemies, but he couldn't outlive his time.